Okay, we are starting the streaming on YouTube. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, and welcome to the fourth day of the 2021 annual seminar on fraternity, social friendship during the time of social distancing. Today's speaker is Professor Stephanie Collins. Professor Collins is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Dianoia Institute of Philosophy at the Australian Catholic University. Her research focuses on analytical, social, political, and ethical theory, particularly group responsibility, the ethics of care, and human rights. She has published 2 books, The Core of Care Ethics in 2015, and Group Duties, Their Existence and Their Implications for Individuals. The title of her presentation today is Loneliness and Obligation. You can find an handout on the chat box. You can find the link where you can find the handout. So thank you very much, Stephanie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for the invitation. It was a real honor to be invited to give this talk to you. As Stefano said, my background is in contemporary, analytic, Anglophone philosophy, particularly social, political, and ethical philosophy. So that's the perspective from which I'm coming at this topic of social friendship during the time of social distancing. And in particular, I suppose that means what I'm concerned to do is to reach quite precise and neatly delineated conclusions about what I'm particularly interested in today is precise and delineated conclusions about what the concepts of rights and the concept of obligations might do for us when we're thinking about loneliness and lack of close, intimate relationships during a time of social distancing. Right, so the question really that I want to address today is what rights and duties arise from the fact of loneliness in the time of social distancing? And can we specify those rights and duties in a way that is both rigorous and defensible? And I'm going to suggest that we can, but there's going to be some work to be done on the way there. So the talk proceeds in 3 sections. Section 1, I'm going to discuss the value of intimate relationships, how that value is currently understood in contemporary analytic normative philosophy. Section 2, I'm going to discuss one possible way of moving from the value of intimate relationships to rights and obligations vis-a-vis those relationships. And I'm going to argue that there are problems with the proposal that I'll discuss in Section 2. And then finally in Section 3, I'm going to make my own proposal for how we can fit the concepts of rights and duties, moral rights and moral duties, that is, into this issue of loneliness in a time of social distancing. Okay. I'm going to aim to talk for about 30 minutes, isn't that? That's right? So that's my plan. That's what I was told, so that's what I'm going to aim for. Okay. Great. So Section 1, the value of intimate relationships. Okay, so first of all, I like to start with definitions so that we're clear what it is that we're talking about. So when I talk about intimates or intimacy, what I'm talking about is people who value us for our own sake, whose well-being is invested in our well-being. So things go well for our intimates when things go well for us, right? Our intimates are happy when we're happy, they're sad when we're sad, they're fearful when we're fearful, so on and so forth. Intimates are people who are inclined to be partial to us over others, right? To give us special consideration over others. They are people who help us to build a coherent life narrative, tell the story of our life and the story of our values and how we kind of got to where we are and where it is that we want to go. And they are people who more generally provide us with familiarity, understanding, closeness, love, care, and concern. Okay, so when I'm talking about intimates or intimacy, I invite you to think about family, friends, loved ones. Most of us probably have at most 10 or 15 people who really fit into this category in our life. This is the category that I want to particularly think about today, and think about in this time where many people are isolated from their intimates, or don't have their intimates around them for various reasons, or can't contact their intimates in the way that they normally would. I want to think about, what does the value of intimacy imply for the rights of those people who lack intimacy and the obligations of others. So to get us there, I want to make, in this first section, 3 kind of general points about the importance of intimacy. Hopefully these points are quite intuitive, although I'd be very happy to come back to them in the discussion if anyone wants to challenge any of these points. But these 3 points are kind of arise out of the history of analytic normative philosophy and their kind of common currency amongst contemporary analytic normative philosophers. So these are the claims that intimacy is important, that intimacy's importance is universal, and that intimacy's value is fundamental. So I'm going to talk through each of these in turn. So first of all, intimacy is important. This kind of goes without saying, right? But it's worth reflecting on why this is. So intimacy is normally taken by normative philosophers to give us distinctive moral reasons. That is to say, we have duties, moral reasons, obligations to be partial to our intimates over others. I have reasons to phone my mother and try to visit her at Christmas if I can, that I don't have to just anybody, right? And that arises out of the nature of our relationship. They give us special obligations. And intimacy's importance, furthermore, is recognized not just in contemporary normative analytic philosophy, but across a range of global ethical traditions, contemporarily and historically. So 2 of the 10 books in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics are devoted to friendship, which Aristotle says is, quote, most necessary for our life, for no one would choose to live without friends, even if he had all the other goods, end quote. Friendship is also extolled by Western thinkers as diverse as Adam Smith, John Locke, Baruch Spinoza, and outside of the Western tradition, people like Confucius hint at the value of the partiality that we give to our intimates when he writes, quote, it is more shameful to distrust our friends than to be deceived by them. So they're emphasizing the value of trust in our friends. In friendship, right, we find and realize the Confucian values of Jin, or fidelity, or faithfulness, Li, or joy, and Ren Dao, or benevolence. So you can see the value of friendship for helping us to realize the values of the Confucian tradition. And more recently, Thaddeus Metz and Anthony Appiah. I don't want to mention too many names in this talk because I think it's kind of confusing for those not enmeshed in the literature, but 2 prominent philosophers have argued that the value of intimacy is central to sub-Saharan African thought as well, historically and contemporarily. Okay, so the point here is, across time and theories and traditions, intimacy has been viewed as morally important, so we should take it seriously. Second point I want to make here is that intimacy's importance is universal across humans. And there's kind of good evolutionary reason for this, right? So intimacy seems to exist at least between all parents and infants, if not between all family members generally in human life. And intimacy plays an important explanatory role in our evolutionary story, right? So various studies show that if children lack intimacy, then they struggle to form valuable relationships later in life. They will come to lack self-esteem. They'll suffer from various physical and psychological disorders. And this kind of makes sense because, of course, say in evolutionary times, intimacy was something without which you couldn't survive childhood, because you have this period of dependency for the first, at least say, 10 years of your life, in which if there aren't people who are naturally inclined to be partial towards you and to give you love, care, and concern, you're not going to survive. Intimacy is essential in children, and also intimacy between adults in the times when humans were evolving to be humans would have been necessary for securing food and shelter and reproduction. Of course, nowadays, in many contemporary societies, as we've learned over the past 18 months, intimacy is not necessary for securing food or shelter, maybe necessary for reproduction, but it's not necessary for securing food or shelter. But that doesn't mean that we're not hardwired to kind of push for it because it was so valuable in times when it was necessary for food and shelter. Okay. There are also various studies. These studies have the problem that a lot of studies have of focusing on weird people, so Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people. But there are still many studies that show that people who lack intimacy and people who are lonely are much more likely than others to suffer from various mental health issues, such as anxiety and depression. And interestingly, they're also more likely to suffer various physical issues, such as immune system problems, heart disease, inflammation, and other chronic health conditions. There was one very prominent study that came out in 2018 that got highly popularized in the press because it claimed that being lonely is as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. I think that the scientists behind that study later kind of said, it's not quite that simple. But nonetheless, loneliness is correlated with a lot of physical problems. Okay. Now, because some of this evidence focuses on humans in particular kinds of societies, we should, of course, be skeptical generalizing too much. But given that we can tell this plausible evolutionary story about the value of intimacy for all humans, it seems really plausible to say that the value of intimacy is probably a human universal, if anything is. Which maybe nothing is, but if anything is, intimacy probably is. Okay, third and final point about intimacy's value is that intimacy's value is fundamental, by which I mean that intimacy's value cannot be reduced to anything else. Its value is not explicable in terms of anything else. Its value is not grounded in the value of anything else. What might the value of intimacy be grounded in? Well, it could be that intimacy is valuable only as a means to happiness, or a means to freedom, or a means to equality. But of course, intimacy doesn't always bring us happiness or freedom or equality, for sure. And yet it's still valuable despite not bringing us those things. So it seems that if intimacy has value, and if it has value even when it doesn't provide other kinds of goods for us, then we should say intimacy is valuable in itself, or its value is fundamental. Now, of course, there's a problem that you can't prove that anything has fundamental value. If you could provide a proof of something's fundamental value, then whatever kind of values occurred or claims occurred in that proof would themselves turn out to be the source of value, right? So if something is of fundamental value, then the very nature of fundamental value is that you can't argue for the fundamental value, you can only point at it. Because if you could argue for it, then the premises in your argument would contain the real fundamental values. So there's an impossibility of proving it. But given that intimacy is valuable even when it doesn't provide us with other goods, it seems reasonable to say that its value is fundamental. It's also noteworthy, as mentioned in the introduction, I work a bit on human rights, and my thinking about this is informed by thinking about human rights. It's worth noting in this context that the value of intimacy grounds other values, by which I mean there are some other values that are valuable only because intimacy is valuable. So let me give an example. We might think about the human right to free speech as being something that's, that should be upheld for all humans. It's very valuable. Maybe it's an overridable right. Why is free speech valuable? Well, one plausible story is that free speech is valuable because of the value of the views that we want to use free speech to express, whether those are religious views, views about what makes the human life good, political views. We use free speech to express our deepest values, and that's what makes free speech valuable. Now, of course, those religious and political and other views that we use free speech to express arise through intimacy, right? We learn those, we come to perceive those, we come to value those through often parent-child relationships or other family relationships. So these values arise through intimacy. I should say this point about intimacy grounding other values is slightly more contentious than a lot of the other claims I've made in this section, but I at least wanted to throw it out there to see what you thought. Okay, So intimacy then is important. Its importance is arguably universal, and its value seems to be fundamental. Okay. The way I'm going to talk about the connection between intimacy and loneliness, I'm going to say that this is kind of a terminological decision, that when we lack intimacy, we suffer loneliness. And this is pretty well borne out by the empirical literature. In general, people who suffer from loneliness are not people who lack Facebook friends or colleagues or acquaintances, right? They're generally people who lack intimates. These people who care about us for ourselves, who give us particularized and strong love, care, and concern, these are the people who prevent us from being lonely, by and large. Of course, this generalization, but by and large. So when we lack intimacy, we suffer loneliness. All right, so that's all on the value of intimacy. That's all well and good. What about the topic of the seminar, right? The time of social distancing. Well, in a time of social distancing, naturally, it's difficult to receive intimacy from people that we do not live with. For those of us like me, actually, who live alone, this means it's difficult to receive intimacy, right? You can only spend so much time on Zoom. So in a time of social distancing, the need for intimacy and the lack of intimacy becomes particularly prominent. And even for those of us who don't live alone, in a time of social distancing in this pandemic era that we're living through, it's also sometimes difficult to receive intimacy from people who we do live with due to added stress and anxiety and pressures and so on that we're all facing. It can put strain on intimate relationships, even for those who do live with their intimates. Okay, so we're at greater risk of loneliness during times of social distancing. So this value that I've been talking about is at greater risk of not being realized. Okay, I'm going to have to pick up the speed a little bit. Section 2, from value to rights and obligations, question mark. So given that intimacy has value, if you're going to allow me that argument to work, then you might think there's a right to intimacy or a right against loneliness. Such a right, you might think, could take the following form. Each person has a claim upon at least one other person, that the second person is willing to enter an intimate relationship with them in order to prevent the first person from being lonely. This is a first pass that you might try and make at how rights and duties can enter into this space of intimacy. Now, this potential proposal, which I'm going to problematize in a minute, but first thing to note about it is consistent with social distancing. So intimates can create, if it's legally permitted, then intimates can create a kind of bubble with each other so that they are physically close only with each other. Of course, there might be some overlap between bubbles of intimates, but social distancing can still occur between sets of intimates, even if the intimates amongst themselves are not social distancing from each other. This bubble language, by the way, was used in my home country of New Zealand during the first COVID lockdown to describe the people that you're allowed to interact with. You're allowed to interact only within your bubble, which for most people was their household, but for people who lived alone, they could bubble with another household, right? Okay. So this potential right to intimacy is consistent with social distancing. However, okay, that's all well and good as a right. What about the obligations? So it's a truism in analytic philosophy that rights entail obligations. If I have a right to something, then it must be the case that someone, somewhere, has an obligation to provide me with that thing. And there are 3 problems, which you might already be thinking of, with the potential obligations that would correlate with this proposed right to intimacy that I've just talked about. So there's a problem with distribution of the obligations, a problem with the demandingness of the obligations, and a problem with the motivation for the obligations. So first of all, the distribution problem. So it simply cannot be that everyone owes this right to absolutely everyone. So again, contrast other kinds of human rights that we might think of. We might think about the right against torture or the right against theft. All 7.7 billion people in the world owe it to me not to torture me. And they all owe it to me not to steal from me. So my right against theft or my right against torture correlates with an obligation for each person in the world, right? And for negative rights, like the right against torture, the right against theft, that kind of universal duty-bearing works because these are negative rights that just demand non-interference. It's much more difficult for so-called positive rights, which require actions on the part of the duty bearer, to say that everyone has the obligation. And with intimacy in particular, there's even a conceptual problem with saying that everyone has the obligation, namely, intimacy demands that our intimates are partial to us over others. But if everyone owes intimacy to everyone, then you can't have everyone being partial to everyone over everyone, because partiality demands that you treat your intimates specially, right? And if everyone is your intimate, you can't treat everyone specially. Okay, so there's even a conceptual problem there with everyone owing the right to everyone. Okay, so it can't be that everyone owes this right to everyone, unlike the right against theft or torture. Instead, it's got to be that the duties are somehow distributed. Now, normally in human rights debates, we would distribute duties to states. So if we're thinking about the right to an education, or the right to subsistence, or the right to healthcare, we would say each person is owed that right from the state. Obviously, that's not going to work with intimacy. Intimacy is not something that our state can give us. Our state cannot guarantee it to us, because our state cannot be our intimate. So these duties are going to have to be distributed amongst individuals. And it's rather unclear how to distribute them. So there's this question, who has the obligation to be willing to enter an intimate relationship with a person who currently has no intimates? How are we going to distribute that? How are we going to distribute that obligation? Distributing that obligation is going to be particularly difficult in a time of social distancing, when a person who currently has no intimates might not have any opportunities to acquire new intimates. Okay, so there's a distribution problem for this right that is not really held by a lot of other rights, particularly human rights, which is what I often think about, not held by other rights that we want to posit, like rights to education or healthcare or so on. Okay, so that's the distribution problem. Second problem is the demandingness problem. So even if we could somehow distribute these rights and distribute the obligations and say, this person has an obligation to be intimate with that person, this person has an obligation to be intimate with that person, these obligations are going to end up being overly demanding. Intimacy is very time and energy consuming, as we all know, right? And philosophers, contemporary analytic philosophers who write about moral over-demandingness, normally accept that our obligations are constrained in various ways, either by our important projects, or by our motivational limitations, or by the space and resources that we need simply to retain our moral agency, or by our autonomy or liberty. There are various stories to tell about what it is that places constraints in our obligations, but on pretty much all of these stories, an obligation to be willing to enter an intimate relationship with someone is going to constrain this, is going to be overly demanding. So if someone has zero inclination to be intimate with me, then a duty for them to be willing to do so would violate their autonomy, their liberty, their important projects, their motivational limitations, the space and resources that they need to retain their agency, and so on. Okay, so put here on the handout, consider, for example, consider the person no one likes, the person no one wants to be intimate with. Any way of assigning the obligation to be intimate with that person is going to be overly demanding. Okay, third problem for this proposed right is the motivation problem. This is more of a kind of conceptual problem. So the problem here is that intimacy produces its characteristic value, which I talked about in section 1, only if it is given from natural desire or inclination, right? So it's no intimacy at all to be intimate with someone from the motive of obligation. Immanuel Kant notwithstanding, we can maybe talk about him in the Q&A, but it's not friendship, right, if it's done from the motive of duty. That means if these obligations are to be distributed amongst people who don't have a natural inclination to be intimate with the right bearers, then it's going to be impossible to fulfill the right to intimacy of a person with whom no one wants to be intimate, because fulfilling the right to intimacy requires that people want to be intimate with that person. Their right to intimacy can be fulfilled only if the person fulfilling the right really wants to fulfill the right. So that's the first motivation problem is that one, that the fulfillment of the right requires that the duty bearer actually wants to fulfill the right. The second motivation problem is about the enforceability of this potential right. So it's often said that what's valuable about rights is that we can stand on them. We can look others in the eye and demand that they respect our rights. We can, in the limit case, take someone to the state. That's not so much what I'm talking about here because I'm talking about moral rights and obligations rather than legal rights or obligations. But we can be angry with someone when they violate our rights. If my friend lies to me, okay, I'm not going to take her to the state because that's not a legal obligation, but I'm going to be angry. I'm going to demand explanation and recompense. This is standing on my right. This is enforcing my right. But the nature of intimacy, for me to say to someone, you owe me intimacy and I'm demanding it from you and I demand an apology that you didn't give it to me and I hold you to account for this, that way of standing on my right undermines their ability to provide me with intimacy. The way I'm going to quote Jeremy Waldron here, fellow Kiwi philosopher, who says, back in the 80s has this quite famous quote in a paper, I think it's called When Justice Replaces Intimacy, the Need for Rights. He says, to stand on, that is demand or enforce one's rights, is to acknowledge that bonds of kinship, affection, and intimacy can no longer hold. So standing on your rights kind of automatically undermines the possibility for intimacy with the person to whom you're making that claim. All right, so that's, so if you're going to enforce the right to intimacy, then it's going to be very difficult to see the right fulfilled. Okay, so those are problems with this initial kind of rather sort of flat-footed or initial proposal that you might make about how we can fit the right to intimacy into our lives. Here's what I want to propose instead, and I'm going to talk about the right to intimacy consideration, which is what I propose instead, and then I'm going to say a little about what it requires in a time of social distancing, and then I'm going to conclude. Okay, so my suggestion is that we replace this proposed right to intimacy with a right to intimacy consideration. So here's the suggestion here. Each person has a right that each other person, so this is, side note, this is going to be a human right because it's a right that each human has. I'm happy to talk more about human rights in the Q&A if people want. So each person has a right that each other person, one, deliberates equitably about their intimacy patterns, and two, acts accordingly. I'll say more about that in a minute. So each person has a duty owed to each other person to deliberate equitably and act accordingly. Okay, kind of convoluted. What does that mean? Let's take the first part. So each person has a duty to deliberate equitably about their intimacy patterns and then act accordingly. So first, deliberating equitably. Deliberating equitably does not mean when you're deciding who to be intimate with, particularly in a time of social distancing, considering each and every person in the world. It doesn't mean that. It rather means considering who it is that you give care and concern to and why. So actually reflecting on that rather than just asserting that it's perfectly morally permissible to do it in whatever way you want. After all, if intimacy is as valuable as I've suggested it is, then it should be open to this kind of moral reflection and consideration. So considering who you give care and concern to and why, and aiming to do so in a way that it avoids bias and that aims to prevent undue loneliness. Okay, so that's what deliberating equitably requires, and then acting accordingly is just going to be acting on the basis of those deliberations. So I've already mentioned this, but I do want to highlight it, that this proposal is a moral duty, not a legal duty. So the suggestion is that this is something, particularly in the times that we're living through, with, well, at least in Australia, with social distancing, it's something for each individual to take seriously. It's not something, it's not a human right that's going to probably get states involved, although I think states do have a role to play. In terms of things like enabling social bubbles in the time of distancing, so allowing people who live alone to see other people if they are lonely, and in terms of facilitating perhaps kind of online meetings between people to create intimacy. I think states do have those kinds of roles to play, but the primary thing that I wanted to talk about today was not so much the state, but rather us as individuals. And my suggestion is not that this obligation that I proposed is somehow enforceable by the state. It's a moral obligation, much like the obligation of fidelity or keeping promises or what have you. Okay. So what does this demand in practice? Okay, I'll do this very quickly. So first of all, this does not demand, sort of giving up our commitments to our existing relationships, nor does it require some kind of sudden redirection of our intimacy as soon as we find out that we have a lonely neighbor or something like this. that kind of sudden redirection or sudden undermining of our existing commitments would undermine the goal of giving people intimacy, since part of the value of intimacy arises only if their intimacy is kind of a long-term relationship. So if you think about the value of someone giving you kind of care and concern, being invested in your happiness, helping you build a life narrative, those are all things that are can only arise and can only acquire their distinctive value if exercised across time and if exercised in a way that the other person can really rely on. So it's not going to require some redistribution of friendship according to some principle of equality or something like that. What might it, if it doesn't involve that, then what might it involve? Well, it may involve special efforts to be kind to those around us who lack intimates, particularly when we're going through a time in which many people who maybe wouldn't normally lack intimates do lack intimates. It may require special attention to those of our intimates who have no one else. So here we might think about relatives who live alone or have few social contacts. It might think about older relatives who live alone in aged care homes, right? This right and obligation is going to require that we give special attention to those intimates of ours. And in an age of social distancing in particular, this right and obligation is going to involve thinking about how best to shape our own immediate circle so as to both maintain social distancing and minimize loneliness, both our own loneliness and the loneliness of others. And this is where the political intersects a little bit with the personal. It might require advocating and supporting programs of states or NGOs or other organizations that aim to reduce loneliness, particularly in a time of social distancing. Okay. So very quickly then, I want to explain that this duty solves the distribution problem. So the duty is held by everyone, like the right against torture or the right against theft. So it doesn't require that we parcel out the duties to particular individuals. The duty, I think, at least as I formulated, I hope also solves the demandingness problem. The duty is not too demanding. It doesn't require that we actually be intimates with those who are not inclined to be intimates towards. Right? It demands that we consider those people in shaping our intimacy practices. It demands that we not take the bonds of family and friendship as a blank check to act on whatever inclinations we happen to have. But it doesn't require much more than that. So it's not, I think, overly demanding. And in any case, it can be shaped so as to not be overly demanding. That is, if you think that it's very easy for an obligation to be over demanding, that we have a very wide sphere of individual liberty or choice, then this obligation is going to be less demanding than if you think that we have a very narrow sphere of individual choice and that morality can kind of infringe a lot on our lives. I want to try to be neutral on that demandingness issue here, while noting that this is an obligation to kind of throw in alongside all the other obligations that we do already recognize to complete strangers, like the obligation against theft or torture or what have you. We let those obligations place quite severe demands on us, right? And so we should let this obligation place at least some demands on us, at least proportionate to those ones. Not the full demands of those ones, but proportionate to the value of intimacy. Okay. Last but not least, this duty solves the motivation problem. So this duty does not require that we be intimates with those whom we completely lack a desire or inclination to be intimates with. It requires only that we consider such people and aim to reduce their loneliness where we can, consistently with concern for ourselves and others. I think this duty can be coherently enforced. I can coherently go to my neighbor and say, I'm a bit lonely and I tried to contact you and you didn't reply to my message, or something like this, right? There, I'm not demanding intimacy per se, I'm demanding consideration. And I think consideration is something that can be enforced, that can be demanded, that can be stood upon without necessarily undermining the ultimate goal of that consideration. Okay, I will leave it there because I have talked for exactly 30 minutes. So that's the suggestion. What should we say about loneliness and obligation in a time of social distancing? I think we can say something, at least minimal, about the rights and obligations that we all have with regard to loneliness in a time of social distancing. And I look forward to the discussion.
Stefano, can you give us some information about how can we proceed? Should we raise questions or via chat or directly here? What can we do?
No, okay, yeah. Sorry, thank you very much. My microphone was off, so sorry. Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Stephanie, and we can stop the streaming on YouTube. Okay. Okay. I don't know, maybe we are still on YouTube. Anyway, no problem. So thank you very much, Stephanie, for this terrific presentation about loneliness, about intimacy, seen as, how can I say, a fundamental human need, a fundamental human value, and on whether we can consider intimacy also as a duty, as an obligation. Yes, we have now some time for discussion, and both online and here in the room, people feel free to just open your microphones and ask questions to Steve.